Economists occasionally make mistakes. Although that may beg our belief, it is indeed true. But there is a greatest error in the history of economic thought. Welcome to episode 85 of the Scottish Liberty Podcast with me, Antony Sammeroff.
And me, Tom Laird.
Our special guest today is George Reisman, Professor Emeritus at Pepperdine University and author of Capitalism, a treatise on economics, which you can find at www.capitalism.net, George Reisman's site, and Amazon. Professor Reisman, thank you so much for joining us on the Scottish Liberty Podcast.
I'm glad to be on it.
So before we get into your article, Rectifying the Greatest Error in the History of Economic Thought, it'd be interesting to know a little bit about the background of your own intellectual development. How did you become a capitalist, a free market advocate?
Well, I was a child during World War II, and I remember asking my father, why did the United States deserve to win the war and all other wars it had fought? And his answer was because of its Constitution. And I got the idea, even as a young child, that the Constitution defined the character of our government. And I learned a little bit as I was growing up that it meant the government cannot tell you what to do, that you had individual rights. And I remember, even as a child, around the age of 6, I shocked many of my acquaintances by openly saying, the president stinks.
Right.
I didn't know anything about the president, but I had the idea that I had the right to say it. Mm. And they were shocked and outraged, and I said, Congress will protect me. I had the basic idea there was a division of powers, and it served to protect the individual citizen. A few years later, I had some athletic equipment. My father had an ambition that I should be an athlete, and so he was sure I had a football and a basketball. And I lived right next door to my junior high school. And I would go into the schoolyard with my football or basketball or whatever, and a bunch of older, bigger, stronger, tougher guys would just grab it, and they'd start playing with it, and I couldn't even be in their game. Hmm. And I grasped that's what the city government and tenants in New York were doing to the landlords with rent control.
Right.
They were seizing other people's property for their own enjoyment and not giving a damn about whoever owned the property. And so I was already well set toward advocacy of individual rights in the free market. And I was this junior high school I went to, and then later the high school. It might as well have been in Cuba. It was filled with far left Marxists, and I was every time I would advance an argument in favor of freedom, they'd say, "Oh, well, the people will starve to death, or wages will be through the floor," one thing after another. And I was looking for defenders of freedom, and the first name that crossed me was Adam Smith.
Right.
He was supposed to be the father of capitalism. And shortly after my bar mitzvah at the age of 13, I had a little extra money. And one of the things I did was buy The Wealth of Nations. And I started reading it. And I read all of book 1. I got bogged down in the digression on silver. I was very disappointed in Adam Smith because what he was saying, he was advancing the position that the wage earners are being cheated by the phenomenon of profit. He viewed profit as a deduction from what was originally, naturally, and rightfully all wages.
Right.
We could go right into, that's my main subject today, but you asked about my development. There were other steps in the development. I got hold of a history of economic thought, and I learned about David Ricardo. and I bought his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And I had a little bit of understanding of it, but here again, Ricardo was propounding the labor theory of value and making it seem that the wage earners deserve the full product, and profit and interest, and anything that isn't wages is an unjust deduction from what should be wages. Well, in the following year, when I was 14, I came across a publication called The Freeman. It was outstanding at the time, not so good today. It was edited by Henry Hazlitt, who was a fantastic individual. And in it, I came across an article by Ludwig von Mises, and it was on Say's Law. And here I saw someone writing with great intellectual force and great self-assurance, and I tried to read a little bit further. By the time I was 15, I was able to read his Socialism, and that changed my life. Okay, well, I ended up getting an introduction to Mises the year later when I was 16. I was with a friend named Ralph Rako, and Mises invited us to attend his graduate seminar at NYU, which we took him up on. And so I was, at that time, in the following fall, I entered Columbia College. And while I was at Columbia, every Thursday night, I would attend Mises's seminar. And after I graduated from Columbia, I enrolled at NYU's business school where Mises was teaching, and I got both my MBA and PhD under him.
Wow, very wonderful. So,
in my view, Mises was the greatest man of the 20th century. The capitalist system was under attack in every aspect, again and again. It had no systematic defense. Mises provided in-depth, thoroughgoing, systematic defense of capitalism. He wasn't right in every single detail, but he was overwhelmingly right, and I think he was the leading defender of civilization in the 20th century because of his defense of capitalism. And I've tried to follow in his path, but I have some important additions of my own to add to what he and a few others have accomplished.
Well, thank you very much. It's very impressive to me that even as a teenager at the age of 13, reading Adam Smith, you were able to point out things in it that you didn't agree with or thought were mistaken.
Right.
It seems like you were born to be an economist with your background, someone who's got the enthusiasm to read David Ricardo and Ludwig von Mises in their teens is certainly destined for greatness, I would say. So,
thank you.
Yes, I'm interested. We're going to talk a little bit about your misgivings about Adam Smith and Marx in terms of Adam Smith having really set the stage for the Marxist labour theory of value. But I'd like to know a little bit more about your history, because this is of great interest to me, as you were personally acquainted with two of my great heroes, Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand. And I would just like to hear a little bit about, two things. It really breaks down to 4 questions, because what your association was like with each of them, what you learned from each of them, and a little bit about how you found them to be as human beings. Because obviously I was born 32 years ago, and I would never have I don't have access to the testimonies of that many people who met these people in person. So that's very precious to me.
Well, the way I met Ayn Rand was once I was in Mises's seminar. I met a man named Murray Rothbard, whom I'm sure some of the members of your audience at least have heard. And I became very close friends with Rothbard from the time I was 16 to the time I was 21. And about a year after I met him, there was a group of us. We called ourselves the Circle Bastiat. And it included Ralph Rako and Leonard Liggio, Bob Hessen, Ronald Hammaway, and a couple of others. And one night Rothbard mentioned Ayn Rand, and he described her as a really fascinating person, and we all wanted to meet her. And so he arranged for a meeting in July of 1954. I think it was July 11th. We had 2 Saturday night meetings, that both of which lasted till 5 in the morning the next day. And I was a utilitarian, having studied under Mises and absorbed his philosophy. And Ayn Rand, of course, was the founder of objectivism. And so the discussion became very contentious. And I was surprised that I couldn't overcome her, and that she kept pushing me to take positions I didn't want to take.
Right.
Wow.
And so, one thing led to another. At some point in the discussion, I expressed the view that in order for motion to be possible, there had to be a void, an absolutely empty space. And she responded to that that was worse than anything a communist could have said.
Wow.
And her reason, of course, was that I was claiming that non-existence, the void, exists.
Right.
And I was stunned by her statement and argument, but I got to understand it sometime later. Anyway, we parted on not too friendly terms, and 4 years later, Atlas Shrugged appeared, or 3 years later, I guess, in 1957, 3 years later. And I read Atlas and was sucked into it. I did nothing for 4 days, except I had to stop to eat and sleep. And I was absolutely overwhelmed by Atlas. And so all of us, Rothbard, myself, Rako, et al., we came down and met Ayn Rand again, and this time on much friendlier terms. Now, as to what I learned from Ayn Rand and Mises, from Mises I learned the great bulk of my knowledge on economics, and I would say a very large extent my knowledge on political philosophy and social philosophy. What I learned from Ayn Rand is mainly concerns the subject of individual rights, freedom, and government, and to some extent epistemology. But I can't claim to understand her epistemology as well as her politics.
Right.
Right.
But I consider myself, I think of her as my intellectual mother and Mises as my intellectual father.
Okay. Can I ask a question? Sorry, it's Tom here, Antony's co-host. There's some people. I mean, I like yourself. I enjoyed Atlas Shrugged, and actually, Anthem is one of my favorite reads and one of her favorite works by her. But some of the people who level criticism at her make the suggestion that she was running something akin to a cult at some point, or was rather cultic in the way that she behaved or the way she ran that group. Is that fair or unfair in your view, or is it overstated? What would you say to that?
Well, there was a cultish aspect.
Right.
And I think she made a profound misjudgment in having a relationship with Nathaniel Brandon that blew up in her face eventually.
Okay.
And the situation there was not completely right.
Mm.
And so you said her way of arguing was to argue by reductio ad absurdum. She made you take. She drew out the consequences of your position.
Well, I won't say her method was reductio ad absurdum. I mean, she used that sometimes.
Right.
But she came up with with a very, very different perspective. And one that initially didn't seem all that convincing, but as you went into it further, it had greater and greater depth and power.
Yes, she was very thorough in her analysis. So, and did you see her many times after the publication of Atlas, or was that just your last meeting?
Well, I saw her fairly frequently. There was a group that had the nickname The Collective.
Right.
It was about 12 or 13 people that met for certain periods every Saturday evening, either in her apartment or Brandon's apartment or someone else, the apartment of someone else in the group.
And I take it that was knowingly ironic to call it the Collective.
Yeah. So that had a substantial influence on me, just listening to her views on one subject after another. And there was a series of 20 lectures that Brandon gave on Introduction to Philosophy, to Objectivism. And that was written largely with her editing. And so that was very informative, too. And also her nonfiction essays. Her essay on rights and the nature of government, they're absolutely outstanding, and I think everyone should read them. She has the clearest exposition of the concept of freedom, the most powerful exposition that you can find anywhere. Mises, unfortunately, is not that clear on the subject of freedom.
Right.
In his third edition of Human Action, improved his treatment of the subject. I think that was under the influence of Ayn Rand, so he absorbed some of her ideas.
Oh, very good. He absorbed some of Rand's ideas. And was his relationship to you pure professional as your supervisor for your PhD, your mentor?
Mises was my mentor, yes. But we didn't have discussions about what I was doing. I worked and worked, and my PhD dissertation was called The Theory of Originary Interest. And it was 640 double-spaced type pages, and I handed it in. And there were, I think, altogether him and two other members of my reading committee, and one of them rejected it.
Wow.
And so at that point, I had to radically reduce the thesis. It was originally 640 pages. One day I may publish it. I have it set up in PDF format, all typeset and all. And I eliminated everything, I think, except one large chapter. And I wrote a new 30-page introduction and maybe a new 30-page conclusion. And finally, the response of the troublemaking committee member was, well, he read it, he liked it much better, except for the first 30 pages. And he hadn't read the last 30. So he managed to like the same thing he had rejected. And it was at that time that I changed from the term originary interest, and I went to the term profit.
Right.
I think profit is the more appropriate term, and that's a source of friction between me and most of the other Austrians.
Right. Would you like to explain the friction, the difference in opinion?
Well, the main thing I would like to explain is it'll be apparent, I think, in my critique of the framework of the Marxian Exploitation Theory, because that's what I consider the greatest error in the history of economic thought.
Yeah.
You know, Adam Smith is usually blamed, is usually denounced as a proto-Marxist because of the labor theory of value and the iron law of wages. The iron law of wages being the doctrine that wages tend toward minimum subsistence.
That's right, and
Now,
history seems to disprove that fact since wages have increased in real terms.
All right. Well, now, the iron law of wages is certainly incorrect, and the labor theory of value is incorrect, but the main error of the exploitation theory is neither the labor theory of value nor the iron law of wages, but its framework. And its framework is that the original form of income is wages. Adam Smith postulates what he calls the original state of things. And in this original state of things, there are supposedly manual workers who are producing and selling products. There are no capitalists. Capital has not yet been accumulated. So these manual workers, somehow without any capital, are producing and selling products. And Smith argues that in this state, the whole produce belongs to the laborer. Here he says, in that original state of things, I'm quoting now from The Wealth of Nations, I think it's the chapter on wages. In that original state of things, which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, but which meant capital, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither landlord nor master to share with him. And then he goes on, had this state continued, the wages of labor would have augmented with all those improvements in its productive powers to which the division of labor gives occasion. And then he goes on to claim that first, land rent is a deduction from what naturally, rightfully, originally was wages. Then the profits of the capitalists in the land. And finally he says the produce of almost all other labor, besides agricultural labor, is liable to the like deduction of profit. In all arts and manufactures, the greater part of the workmen stand in need of a master, employer, to advance them the materials of their work and their wages and maintenance till it be completed. He shares in the produce of their labor, or in the value which it adds to the materials on which it is bestowed, and in this share consists his profit. So this is the fundamental framework of the exploitation theory, that wages are the original, primary, rightful income, and then later, when capitalists appear and profit appears, the profit is a deduction from what naturally, rightfully, and originally was all wages. And that's what I call the greatest error in the history of economic thought. Because if we look carefully, and here I have to make reference to another major proposition of classical economics, this one advanced by John Stuart Mill, and it's known as demand for commodities is not demand for labor. And Mill argues when you buy a commodity, the produce of labor, you are not paying wages. That wages are paid before the product is produced, not in the purchase of the product. And that is a profound truth. And the full title of my article is Rectifying the Greatest Error in the History of Economic Thought. John Stuart Mill's demand for commodities is not demand for labor versus the framework of the Marxian exploitation theory. Because let's look at this a little closely. If we've got workers producing and selling products, the money they receive is not wages. Wages is money paid in exchange for the performance of labor. Not for the products of labor, but for the performance of labor itself. And if you pay wages, you don't have to pay for the product. You own the product by having paid the wages. Imagine, for example, you hired a housekeeper and you gave her money to buy food and so forth. And now she's serving you dinner. Would you be presented with a check for dinner?
No.
No, and why not? Because you already own the dinner since you paid for the labor and everything else necessary to produce the material, the product. If you in fact buy the inputs, you do not buy the output. You already own the output. If you buy the output, it's because you have not bought the inputs. Now, these workers in Adam Smith's original state of things were producing and selling products, or to whatever extent they were producing and selling products.
Sure.
Maybe the products might only have been a rock and a stick. And Smith himself gives such an example. He refers to Scotch pebbles.
Yeah.
There were a group of people in Scotland who were gathering pebbles from the seashore and they're selling the pebbles. And Smith assumed that when they sold the pebbles, they were being paid wages. They weren't. They were being paid a sales revenue, a product sales revenue. So the first point to realize is that in the original state of things, the money the workers were paid was product sales revenues, not wages. There were no wages. Now, because there were no capitalists, a capitalist, according to Smith and also to Marx, is someone who buys for the sake of selling.
Right.
Well, there were no capitalists. Now, costs, the phenomenon of costs that are deducted from sales revenues, is the result of capitalistic expenditure. You know, I should have pointed out already that Marx took over this framework completely.
Yeah.
And Marx distinguished between what he called simple circulation and capitalistic circulation. Simple circulation is a replica of Smith's original state of things. Simple circulation is described by the sequence CMC. Commodity, money, commodity. The workers are producing commodities, C. They're selling the commodities for money, M. And then they're using the money to buy other commodities, CMC.
Okay.
That's simple circulation. Now, capitalistic circulation is money, commodity, money. The capitalist lays out money, M, has the workers produce a commodity, C, which is then sold for a larger sum of money, M prime.
Right.
Which he thought was exploitative.
Yeah, that's where exploitation came in. That's where profit came in, and it came in as a deduction from what was originally naturally and rightfully all wages. Now the joke is that in CMC and Smith's original state of things, there are no wages, there's sales revenues, and because there's no capitalistic expenditure, no buying for the sake of subsequently selling, there are no costs. A cost that appears in a business income statement represents money that has been previously expended for the purpose of producing the product that is going to be sold. It's the initial M. Costs, including wages, are found in the initial M in the MCM sequence. Now, if there are no capitalists, no M, it's just CMC, the only income is profit. The income of the workers in Smith's early and rude state of society, his original state of things, their income is not wages but profit. Profit is the original primary labor income. And what the capitalists are responsible for is not the phenomenon of profit, since that's already there without them. They're responsible for the phenomena of wages paid in production and the other expenditures that show up as costs. So capitalists are responsible not for creating profit and deducting it from wages, but for creating wages and other costs which serve to reduce the proportion of sales that is profit. The capitalists create wages and reduce the proportion of sales that is profit. It's the exact opposite.
Right, yes. And it's interesting because if you take the view that capitalists are just skimming something off the top, just skimming a little profit off the top and exploiting the workers, why aren't the workers going to the bank and buying over the factory, kicking out the capitalists to save on a 12% profit margin and deliver a cheaper product? Obviously, the capitalists must be providing some value to the workers, otherwise they would just be self-employed instead. They would make more money being self-employed.
Yeah, they're making more money. They're making more money as wage earners working for the capitalists than they would as sellers of products. They're making higher wages than they would profits.
Okay, so this might have been quite a heavy rundown. So let's just review very quickly. You start with the point that Adam Smith was mistaken in that he thought in the original state of affairs, when people are just producing products, they are creating wages for themselves. then a capitalist comes along and employs them, and suddenly this concept of surplus value emerges, not from Adam Smith but from Marx, which is that the capitalist is actually skimming off the top a surplus value, something that should otherwise be the rightful property of the workers, that he's just exploiting them. It's interesting to note that you mentioned that Adam Smith, because he's widely considered to be a free marketeer and an advocate.
Yes, in many ways he is. Adam Smith is a very mixed case.
Yeah. Right.
This is the worst error in the history of economic thought. But in other respects, like it's not from benevolence but from self-interest that we expect to get things from other people.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think we can say that Adam Smith didn't have the benefit of Adam Smith when he was coming up with his theories.
Well, you could argue that that's a legitimate point, but the main point is that Smith has a confusion. He thinks that wages and labor are indissolubly connected, or inseparably connected.
Right.
When in fact, profit is the original labor income. Profit was the income of the manual workers in the original state of things.
Right.
They had sales revenues, but they didn't have costs. Why didn't they have costs? Because they hadn't acted capitalistically. They hadn't expended any money for the purpose of bringing in their sales revenues. So there were sales revenues, but zero costs. 100% of the sales revenues were profit. Then, when capitalists appear, expenditure for means of production, including the payment of wages, begin. So the capitalists are responsible not for the phenomenon of profit, which exists before them, but for the phenomenon of wages and the other costs of production.
Okay.
And it serves to reduce the proportion of sales that is profit. Now, the next question is, what about later on, after we're out of the original state of things and into more modern conditions? What is the status of profit in those conditions? I would say profit is still a labor income, but the labor is more and more of an intellectual character, and the profits, Smith rejected the idea that profit could be a labor income because he realized that profit varies with the amount of capital invested. It tends to be larger on a larger capital and smaller on a smaller capital. And that does not contradict the fact that profits are a labor income, because they're an income of intellectual labor, of thinking and planning and decision-making. Mm-hmm. So if you have more capital rather than less, you apply your ideas on a larger scale. If you own one shoe store and you have an improved idea, or if you own 10 shoe stores, you can apply that idea on 10 times the scale, and you should expect to be able to make on the order of 10 times the profit.
Right.
Now, the fact that the profits can vary with the capital and do not have to vary exclusively with the labor, that does not mean they're not a labor income. A labor income varies with the means it employs. Like if we were looking at two workers digging a hole, one with an ordinary shovel and one with a steam shovel, the one with the steam shovel would expect to have a much larger hole.
Yeah.
But does that mean that the whole is not the product of labor?
Right.
The products are always the result of labor, even though the product varies with the power and efficiency of the means employed. Now, Adam Smith failed to realize this, and I parody him on this subject. He gives an example of firms with two different capitals, one with 700 pounds, I think, and another with 7,300 pounds. And he says, though their profits are so very different, this labor of inspection and direction, as he called it, may be either altogether or very nearly the same. Well, that's true of a worker with a shovel and a worker with a steam shovel. But in both cases, they're still the products of labor.
Right.
And so what I would say is the fundamental producer, let's say in the old Ford Motor Company or Standard Oil, that's primarily the product of Ford and Rockefeller. The guys on the assembly line are the help.
Yes.
But the fundamental producer is the capitalist who's laying out the plans and the organization. And further, the Marxists are complaining they want the labor's right to the whole produce.
Right.
They want... Well, that right is realized every day in capitalism when business firms and businessmen are paid for the products. The products are their products, not the products of the guys on the assembly line. The guys on the assembly line are the help in the production of the capitalist product. Now, let me give you a further application of this principle. Why is it that we normally say that Columbus discovered America, or Napoleon won the Battle of Austerlitz, or that the President of the United States has a foreign policy? Why do we credit the discovery of America to Columbus and not to the members of his crew, Seaman Giuseppe, Seaman Juan, First Mate Pedro, or whatever? Why Columbus? Because Columbus provided the guiding, directing intelligence at the highest level.
Yes. He's the prime
mover. It's to him that we attribute the product, and the other guys are the help in the realization of Columbus's discovery. And similarly, with Napoleon at Austerlitz, Napoleon provided the guiding, directing strategy at the highest level.
Right.
And okay.
So to quote Rand, more or less, the original means of production is the human mind.
Right, and it's still the human mind, and the human mind employs means of production which enabled it to accomplish results in the real world. And the greater the capital, the larger the scale on which you can apply your ideas. You can employ helpers, equip them, but it's your product.
Right, and I would just like to add a point on that, George, because this is often thought by critics of capitalism to be some form of greed where those who accumulate wealth can accumulate more wealth without contributing their labour. But I think it's important to realise that this isn't just good from our individualist perspective, which it is, which means if you've got good ideas, you make good money, but it also performs a really important social function in the economy, which is that people who are shrewd in using resources accumulate more resources to shepherd, and those who make bad plans and make bad decisions with their investments, they lose that capital. So this system of investment, of profit and loss, shepherds capital into the hands of those who are good at predicting what the market, which is you, me, Tom, and everyone listening, want to buy. Because why do you want people who are not good at predicting what we want to be in charge of large stacks of resources? The better you are at serving the market, the more resources you get to shepherd towards productive ends. Yeah,
that's certainly true. And, this connects with further points. People have no idea about how private property actually operates.
Yeah.
They don't realize that you don't have to own something to benefit from it.
That's so true.
You don't have to own the steel mills and the iron mines and the auto plants to get the benefit. You get the benefit when you buy the product. When you buy an automobile, you're getting the benefit of the auto plant that produced it. You're getting the benefit of the steel mill that produced the steel that goes to the automobile, and of the iron mine, and so on. So we get the benefit of capital in our capacity as consumers and in our capacity as wage earners, because the privately owned means of production are the source, A, of the supply of products, and B, of the demand for labor. So we have that twofold general benefit.
Okay, George, can I just ask you, sorry, I just want to clear something. In your view, What was it that, why did Smith make that mistake? What was it he missed? Why did he miss it?
Because I think he fused the concept of wages and labor together.
Okay.
He thought wherever there is labor, the income is wages.
Okay.
Right.
And everyone has followed him in that.
Right.
But if you look at matters from the perspective of business accounting, you've got sales revenues, not wages, and if you have no capitalists, you have no monetary costs. So the entirety of the sales revenues is profit.
Okay.
Now, I wish I could go back in a time machine and have a talk with Adam Smith.
Yes.
Or if I missed Adam Smith, talk to John Stuart Mill, because his proposition, demand for commodities is not demand for labor, implies just about everything I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right. So you explicated from that original idea. So I wanted to dovetail some of your points. One was...
And let me just say, I deal with this at great length in my book, Capitalism, a Treatise on Economics.
Which people can get from capitalism.net.
Right, and also they can get a Kindle version. The hard copy version is $95, but the Kindle version is $9.99.
Very good. And it is a mighty tome, very educational, it's very comprehensive.
And on my website, you could download a PDF replica of the hard copy. And at present, there's no charge on that. You're welcome to download a copy.
Excellent.
And it's fully searchable. The contents are hyperlinked to every section in the contents. So I think this is a revolutionary idea. Unfortunately, my experience is that hardly anyone understands it.
Right.
I don't know why. It seems very simple to me.
Okay.
Right. So
not everybody's a professor, George.
No, but grammar school students should be able to understand
Yes,
it.
if it's demonstrated. And that's a frustration to me as an economics enthusiast. So many of our ideas are perceived as impenetrable, but readily understandable when they're well explained. So, for example, you were mentioning the fact that people don't need to own something to benefit from this, and I believe that's the insight that I think I got it from Mises, which was that one of Marx's major errors was that he only saw people in their capacity as producers.
Yes.
But he didn't take into consideration their role as consumers. So as the capitalist industrialization takes place, more machines are invented, things get cheaper and cheaper. Those labourers may be on the same wage, but that wage can buy more stuff. So they're effectively richer in real terms. They're richer in real terms.
That's true. And the real wages rise not by virtue of people earning more money, but by virtue of the productivity of labor rising. The productivity of labor is the output per worker. The higher the average output per worker, the larger is the supply of goods relative to the supply of labor, and therefore the cheaper are goods relative to labor. That's not recognized. But also we have to say, what Marx, pardon me?
Please finish your point first.
Yeah. What Marx also held, he claimed with the iron law of wages, that if you could reduce the price of the workers' necessities, the capitalists would immediately follow that up by slashing wages.
Right.
That the capitalists have total arbitrary power over wages. But that's not true.
No.
Labor is scarce, and it's required in the production of everything. There is a greater implicit desire for labor than there is labor. Labor is fundamentally scarce. What causes unemployment is not that we don't need the labor, but that it's overpriced.
Right.
And as wage rates fall, the quantity of labor demanded grows, and under capitalism, wage rates fall no lower than to the full employment point. And once wage rates hit the full employment point, occupation by occupation, location by location, the self-interest of the capitalists dictates raising wages. See, we have to think of it in terms of an auction. Suppose you're at an auction, you want to buy the first edition of my book.
Right.
Okay. Now, you're willing, or a painting, there's some beautiful painting you want. Let's say you're willing and able to spend up to $2,000 to buy this painting. There's someone else who's willing and able to spend up to $1,000 to buy the painting. Now, you'd rather get the painting for less than $2,000. You don't want to spend your maximum. You'd rather get it for $1,000 than $2,000. You'd rather get it for $500 than $1,000.
Yeah.
You'd rather get it for nothing at all. All right, what happens if the bidding starts and you insisted on bidding no more than $900? But there's someone else who's willing and able to pay up to $1,000.
Yeah.
Then he would get it.
Yeah.
All right, so what does your rational self-interest require? Is it to seek to pay the lowest price you'd like or could imagine, or rather to pay the lowest price that is simultaneously too high for your next nearest bidder?
Yeah. That's
Right.
what you want.
Yeah,
Your self-interest is to pay not the lowest price you'd like, but the lowest price above $1,000. That's the maximum bid of your next nearest bidder. Well, it's the same with employers. It's just instead of one unit of supply being available, there are millions and tens of millions. But still, if the wage goes below the full employment point, so that there are employers able and willing to pay more, but the labor they want is being snatched up by other employers not able to pay as much,
Right.
well, what does their self-interest dictate?
They have to raise wages.
They must raise wages. They must knock out the competition of the less capable employers, the less payment-capable employers.
Yeah, so
And that's what happens.
Yeah.
When there is a labor shortage, employers will conspire with the workers to break the law. If you have wage controls and there's a labor shortage, employers will give out phony promotions as a means of raising wages.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, you can't pay someone much less than someone else is willing to pay them. And so fundamentally, the wage that someone accepts is not an arbitrary sum set by the capitalist, but arrived at by the laws of supply and demand. If you gain more skills, you're liable to command a higher wage.
If you have a free labor market,
Right. That's true.
Because then if there's unemployment, wages go down, but they stop going down when the full employment point is hit.
Yeah.
One occupation at a time. Like full employment for carpenters in Des Moines, that stops the further fall in wages of carpenters in Des Moines.
Right.
So you don't have to have full employment across the whole economy for this to work. It works occupation by occupation, location by location.
Right. So why?
It's to the self. You see, what people are walking around with, they have the idea, well, the workers need their wages. They must work or they'll starve. And employers are greedy. So they think of this combination of worker need and employer greed, and they think put the two of them together, and wages go to the floor. They'll go to subsistence or less than subsistence. But the reality is the need of workers is irrelevant to the wages they actually have to accept.
Right.
And an example I give of this is, imagine that you had a late model car, but you're committed now to take a job. I use the example of Manhattan Island in New York City. I imagine it's the same in London. Suppose here you are, you're living in Scotland, you own a car, and it's no problem to park it and garage it and whatever. But if you were to move into a densely populated city, you'd have a very big expense to garage the car, or else spend half your life looking for a parking spot. And if you can't do that, you must get rid of the car. How much would you be willing to sell it for?
Well, for as high a price as I possibly could command. Possibly.
How much would you be willing to take? What would be the lowest you'd be willing to take? You can't keep the car. You're going to London or wherever. You must get rid of the car.
Right. So
I would say you'd be willing, if necessary, if there were no alternative,
Sure.
you'd pay to call a tow truck to take it away to the junkyard.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, because
Okay, but you don't have to do that. Why don't you have to do that? Because late model used cars are scarce and
Right.
valuable. People want them. So there's a market in those cars, and you can sell your car at the prevailing market price for such cars. Even though you're willing to sell it for nothing or pay to have it taken off your hands, that's irrelevant. In the same way, the willingness of workers to work for minimum subsistence if they had no alternative, that's irrelevant. Wages are determined by the competition of the employers for scarce labor.
Yeah.
right.
Now, so the worker need is irrelevant to wages.
Yeah.
And now what about employer greed? Well, we've just covered that a few minutes ago.
Sure.
Employer greed, the self-interest of the employers, again, is not the lowest wages they would like, but the lowest wages that are simultaneously too high for other potential employers to pay.
Yeah. So why, in your opinion, George, does this myth persist, though, of the drive to the bottom?
Pardon me?
Why this would seem straightforward, but why does the myth of the drive to the bottom, the idea that wages will go down, why does that persist?
Why does the idea that wages go to the minimum subsistence level?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because it's a mistaken thought. I mean, why does any wrong idea persist?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now we don't have very much experience with the full employment and tight labor markets. They've existed in wartime when there are wage controls.
Yeah.
When the government on the one side is pouring in new and additional money, and on the other controlling wages and prices, then you get a labor shortage, and then employers, to beat the wage controls, will give out phony promotions as a means of raising wages.
Right.
But now, if we had a free labor market and money wages were lower than where they are now, but the labor market was tight, and this was the normal experience, then people would see that wages do not tend to go to subsistence.
Got you.
They get further and further above subsistence, and it happens by virtue of the businessmen and capitalists continually introducing newer, better products and lower cost, more efficient methods of production.
Right.
Now, I go into all of this in great detail in Capitalism. The matters we've been discussing today are treated mainly in chapters 11 and 14.
Right.
11 is the division of labor and the concept of productive activity, and 14 is the productivity theory of wages.
Okay.
So if you were to just explicate quite briefly what the Marxian exploitation theory is in short, how would you put it?
Well, it starts off with the idea that wages are the original just form of income, that when capitalists appear, they deduct profits, interest, land rent, they deduct all income wages, and that's what they pocket, and that's the exploitation. And at the same time, the Marxists have this absolutist view of the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value in Marxism is different than in classical economics.
Right.
The Marxian view is an insane version. So they argue the basis of profit, according to the Marxists, is that the worker can produce a larger output than is required to sustain himself and enable him to work.
Yeah.
And you've heard the expression wage slave, and they say that capitalism is slavery. Well, that's how they see it. Because ask yourself, what is it that enables the slave owner to gain from owning a slave? It's the fact that if the slave is doing a full day's work, he can produce more in that day's work than is required to maintain himself.
Yeah.
That's correct, yeah. Otherwise
and that's what the Marxists are claiming. The Marx's own example is he imagines that the working day is 12 hours, but the wage earner only needs the products of the labor of 6 hours to live. So the capitalist gains 6 hours of surplus labor time, 6 hours of labor time over and above what's required to support the worker. And the worker is in the same position as a slave. The master gains from a slave because the slave can produce more than is required to maintain the slave. And that's the position that Marx says the worker is in under capitalism.
And it always amazes me that Marxists seem to think taking a job and being paid a wage which is voluntary is somehow exploitative, but being forced to pay taxes which is not voluntary is not exploitative. It seems like a crazy measuring stick. I was also reminded of the point raised by von Bauwerk that the capitalist puts up front, gets paid last. He puts up front the money at the beginning, and if there's a profit, he gets paid. So actually, he's being paid for the time value of money. All the wage labourers, they get paid right away up front, whereas he's unburdening them of having to produce something, then sell it. They get paid as they produce.
Von Bauwerk's critique of Marx is truly ingenious, but unfortunately, he's accepting the framework of the exploitation theory, because he's imagining that the wage earner is the primary producer and that his income would be wages. Now, if in fact we had, you see, von Bauwerk is imagining one worker is producing materials that the next worker converts into steel parts, a third worker is assembling it into an engine. He's got 5 workers in his example. But if we had an arrangement like that, the income that these workers would be earning would not be wages but profit.
Right.
They're producing a finished engine in 5 years. They would have sales revenues, but there's no money costs.
Right.
And so they would have to divide profit. And the capitalist is the one who introduces the wages. He's responsible for the phenomenon of wages.
Right, so when we discussed Adam Smith, you mentioned that in many ways he's a free market economist, but he had some bad ideas thrown in.
He had a horrible idea. This is really an awful idea, the primacy of wages, that wages are the first income.
And being a great intellectual and a forerunner, many people accepted that idea blind. Now here's a more interesting and controversial question. Do you think that Marx had any good original ideas?
Well, he has one idea that can be used, one useful idea, and that is his idea of capitalistic circulation, MCM prime, can be used to represent the economic degree of capitalism. How capitalistic is the system economically? Now, in Smith's original, the way we can do it is we divide the first M by the second M. Okay. M over M prime. That represents the economic degree of capitalism. In Smith's original state of things, the first M is 0. So we have 0 over M. The system is not economically capitalistic at all. The more economically capitalistic is the system, the higher is M over M prime. That means wages are going to be higher relative to profits. The first M is the costs. The second M is the sales revenues. The higher our costs relative to sales revenues, the more economically capitalistic the system is. You have to apply this proposition on the basis of the whole economic system, not on the basis of an individual industry which is in competition with all the others. But the system as a whole is the more economically capitalistic, the higher is the buying of the means of production relative to the sales. And now, the higher is M over M prime. Not only are wages higher relative to profits, which is the difference between the two M's, but the larger will production be and the more rapidly rising, because the higher is the demand for capital goods, the demand for machinery, materials, etc., which along with wages is included in the first M. The money being outlaid is to pay wages and to buy materials and machinery. The higher is the expenditure for materials and machinery relative to the expenditure for consumer goods, the more the economy concentrates on capital goods, the larger will be the supply of capital goods, and the more rapidly growing it will be, which means the more rapidly growing, the higher and more rapidly growing will be the productivity of labor. So as the system becomes more economically capitalistic, more M relative to M prime, the wage share of national income becomes larger, and real wages rise because prices fall and continue to fall relative to wages. So I go into that in great detail in chapter 14.
Okay,
Capitalism.
great. So I just want to say a little bit about theories of value before we go, because you're the labor theory of value. I mean, if the Marxian view is correct, then we can pay some people to dig a hole and then pay some other people to fill up that hole again, and they've apparently created some value because there's labor.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So is that an unfair categorization of the labor theory of value?
Well, it depends. In that form, Marx talks about socially necessary labor.
Right.
That the value of products reflects the amount of labor that is socially necessary.
As seen by him.
Or as seen by him, or we can concede that point that there's no reason to dig a hole and then fill it up again.
Right.
But it is true that in his theory, that should make the thing more valuable. Marx ignores everything else besides labor.
Right.
Okay.
Ricardo was very different. Ricardo acknowledged the time factor and the rate of profit, and also all kinds of individual scarcities. I don't know if you've read Ricardo, but he has a statement, scarce books and coins, paintings by old masters, whatever. Their value has absolutely nothing to do with the quantity of labor required to produce them, or that was expended in producing them. And also, I'm sorry?
I'm just saying he noticed that they were valuable because they were scarce rather than because...
Yeah, they were scarce, and their value was determined by their utility. And Ricardo would have agreed marginal utility had he been aware of the concept.
Right, yes, so that...
Okay. Okay, now, also, Ricardo recognized that we could have two products of identically the same amount of labor, but to the extent that some of the labor was employed further back in the past, the product would be more valuable. And he gives an example like this. Suppose we have a product, you have to spend £1,000 in wages to produce the product, and the rate of profit is 10%. All right, how much does the product sell for? £1,100.
Right.
Now suppose we take half of the labor and employ it 2 years back. We spend £500 on a quantity of labor. Then the following year we spend another £500 to buy an equivalent amount of labor, and the rate of profit is 10%. How much will that product sell for? We have 500. You have to allow 10%. So that the product would be worth 550. Then we have 500 more in wages. Mm-hmm. The total cost of this product is £1,050. Yeah. What will it sell for? Well, it's 10% of £1,050. It'll sell for $11.55.
Sure.
So, and now you can get more extreme. Suppose we have an equal quantity of labor employed in the production of 40-year-old Scotch. Versus that same quantity of labor employed in the production of a product that will be ready next year. Well, if the rate of profit is 10%, the one product will be worth 1,000 times 1.1, and the other will be worth 1,000 times 1.1 to the 40th.
Right.
Okay.
So Ricardo was excellent on these kinds of cases. And also, if the rate of profit changes, it's going to change the relative values. So Ricardo saw that. It's wrong to think of Ricardo as a Marxian. He's very different.
So,
and also, you see, Marx believed in the iron law of wages, that wages would go to subsistence.
Yeah.
Now, there was a sense in which Ricardo believed that too, insofar as he thought population growth would require taking poorer and poorer land into cultivation and cultivating the existing land ever more intensively. Well, if those were the facts, wages would be falling and they would hit subsistence. But if you have economic progress, as we had, then there is no tendency for the productivity of labor in agriculture to fall. In fact, it's risen so much that a great deal of land was thrown out of cultivation. Like there's a lot of land in Britain that was cultivated back in the 18th century that stopped being cultivated later in the 19th century because supplies of American grain could be imported much cheaper. And so you had the return to pasture. And with modern technology, we keep improving the productivity of labor in agriculture and everywhere else. So there's no possibility of the so-called iron law of wages working by that dimension. But Marx, his iron law of wages was not the fact that you'd have diminishing returns and the need to cultivate ever inferior grades of land. His version of the iron law of wages is the capitalist just arbitrarily puts the wages at minimum subsistence.
Right, because he has the power to do that. That's the mistaken idea.
Right. So one of the things I try to do in my book is dehomogenize Marx and classical economics. They're very, very different. The classical economists, whatever their errors, they had great, magnificent things to say, and the Austrians ignore them at their peril.
Right. And you've kind of sieved out the bad ideas and kept the good ideas.
Right. I think there's one basic line of thought in economics, and it includes the classical economists and the Austrian economists. It runs from Smith or a little bit earlier with the physiocrats and goes to Mises and hopefully beyond.
Just before we finish up, I would like to ask one more question then, because we know what the incorrect idea regarding value is. What is the correct idea regarding value? Like, how is the value of commodities or anything arrived at?
Okay, it's arrived at, we start with demand and supply, but demand and supply work mainly in broad factor markets. Demand and supply are at work in determining wages, wage rates, the prices of certain basic industrial commodities that can be produced only in limited quantities. It's at work in determining the prices of rare goods like paintings by old masters and so forth. But the great bulk of prices are determined on the basis of cost of production. The costs of production are themselves determined ultimately by demand and supply. Wages are determined by demand and supply. That's the most important element in costs of production.
Okay.
Prices of land are determined by demand and supply.
Yeah.
But most regularly produced commodities are determined by cost of production. And interestingly, Baum-Bawerk and Wieser recognize this. I'd like to give you a reference on this subject because it's very important. It's in my book. There's an article by Baum-Bawerk that was reprinted in the Journal of Austrian Economics some years ago, toward the beginning of the century, called Ricardo and Baum-Bawerk on Cost of Production versus the Elasticity of Demand.
Okay.
on page 414 in my book. There's a lengthy paragraph here. You mind if I start reading it? This is a quotation from von Bavard.
Sure,
go for it.
Let us alter the order of the presuppositions of our typical example accordingly. Someone possesses a rather large supply of means of production of second order, G sub 2. From each of these groups, he can produce at will a consumption good of the category A, or one of the category B, or finally of category C. He desires, of course, to take advanced measures toward balanced provision for his various wants, and will therefore draw simultaneously on various parts of his supply of means of production to produce consumption goods of all three categories, and he will produce amounts in each in accordance with his needs. If there is genuinely balanced provision, the quantities produced will be so regulated that needs of approximately equal importance depend upon the last specimen in each category, and that thus the marginal utilities are approximately equal. In spite of that, it is not impossible that there will be differences, possibly even quite considerable differences, in the marginal utilities, because as we already know, the graduation of concrete wants occurring in any one category is not always either uniform or continuous. Now, he goes on, if under all circumstances the marginal utility attainable by a good within its own category were determinative of its value, then the categories B and C would have to receive a value divergent not only from that of category A, but also from the value of its costs, G2. B would then have a value of 120, C a value of 200. But here we are confronted with one of the cases where through substitution, a possible loss in one category is transferred to another, and as a result, the marginal utility of the latter becomes determinative for the other as well. Thus, if a specimen of category C is lost, it is not necessary to forego the marginal utility of 200, which the specimen would have delivered directly. Instead, it is possible to convert one unit of the means of production G2 into a new specimen C, and in its place rather produce one specimen fewer in that category, in which the marginal utility and hence the loss in utility is least. And indeed, that possibility becomes a reality. The category in question in our example is the category A. Because of the opportunity which production offers for substitution, a specimen C is therefore not valued in accordance with its own marginal utility of 200, but in accordance with the marginal utility of the least valuable related product, the product A. Its value is therefore 100. The same applies naturally to the value of category B and would apply generally to every category of good which is productionally related to A, and of which the direct marginal utility is also greater than that of category A. This leads to some important consequences. The first is that in this way, the value of goods having a higher individual marginal utility occupies the same rank as the value of the marginal product, and hence also the same rank as the means of production from which both emanate. The identity which exists in principle between value and cost, therefore, obtains in this instance as well. But it is to be carefully noted that here the coinciding is brought about in quite a different way from that which was followed in the case of costs and marginal products. In the latter instance, the two coincide because the value of the means of production accommodates itself to the value of the product. The value of the product is the determinant factor. The means of production is the factor that is determined. In our present case, it is the other way around, and it is the value of the product that must do the accommodating. Ultimately, it accommodates only to the value of another product, but initially it accommodates also to the value of the means of production from which it emanates, and which brings about its substantial connection with the marginal product. The transmission of value proceeds, so to speak, along a broken line. First, it goes from the marginal product to the means of production, fixes the value of the latter, and then ascends in the opposite direction from the means of production to the other products, which it is possible to produce from them. In the end, then, the products of higher immediate marginal utility derive their value from their means of production. Let us translate the abstract formula into terms of concrete practice. Good B or good C is, in general, a product of higher immediate marginal utility. If now we consider what good B or C is worth to us, our first response is just exactly as much as the means of production are worth to us, from which we can at any moment replace the product. If we then inquire further and ask how much the means of production themselves are worth, we arrive at the marginal utility of the marginal product. But on innumerable occasions, we can spare ourselves this further inquiry. Time and again, we already know the value of the good that comprises the cost, of the goods that comprise the cost, without any necessity for working it out from its foundation and proceeding onward from case to case. And on all these occasions, we simply determine the value of products by their cost. And in doing so, we are taking advantage of an abbreviation which is as accurate as it is convenient. Let me try to boil that down if I can. We've got the same means of production, or groups of means of production, that can produce three different consumers' goods, A, B, and C.
Right.
Let's say A is surgical sutures. Now, what is the marginal utility of having the surgical sutures available for an operation, or the scalpel, or whatever? Right. It's as high as a life, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but now suppose we have a sufficient supply of the means of production from which scalpels, sutures, whatever are produced, to produce lots of other things of much, much less importance.
Right.
Like a thread to sew a button on a jacket. The marginal employment of these means of production is at the level of a button on the jacket.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what determines the value of the means of production.
Right.
Okay.
Then these other vitally important things, their value is determined from the value of the means of production. Now, cost of production is never an ultimate determinant of value, but it is a determinant of value in leveling down products of supra-marginal utility to marginal utility. That's the gist of what he's saying. It's too much in too little space. I really urge you to read that section, that discussion of Böhm-Bawerk.
Right, so that you can really get the way that the ordinal value of each unit of means of production plays into the ultimate value of products that are produced.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The marginal utility. Well, you see, like when people are thinking of the marginal utility of water, and assuming water is more valuable than diamonds, they're looking at someone drinking water who's dying of thirst.
Yeah.
Right.
But in normal circumstances, the water you drink to slake your thirst is no more important than the water you use to spray a beer can down your driveway.
Right.
Yeah.
It's determined by the marginal value.
Sure.
Now, what Böhm-Bawerk is doing is saying the same means of production can have physically different products. And those physically different products, some of them might be in the category of the water needed to avoid dying of starvation. And other units of the means of production are producing radically lower, less important things. Well, the value of the means of production is determined by the value of the marginal product, and then the value of the means of production comes forward and brings down the value of the supra-marginal products to conform to the value of the marginal product. That's what's present in the cases in which value is determined by cost.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I fear we're running out of time, but I certainly feel like I have been a party to the Mises seminar this evening. Thank you so much, George, for joining us and educating us on these really important points on economics, particularly the greatest error in the history of economic thought. Get George's book at capitalism.net or on Amazon. Yeah, thank you so much, George, for satisfying my curiosity on Rand and Mises, because that's something of great interest to me.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.